Coming up, President Yoon arrives in Spain to attend the NATO summit this week and prepares to embark on a series of bilateral meetings with world leaders. The 5-day trip marks the new president's first diplomatic engagement overseas. G7 nations pledge to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, while Russian missiles hit a busy shopping center in central Ukraine, killing 13 and injuring around 50. South Korea's power company KEPCO raises electricity prices by 5 won per kilowatt-hour amid rising costs and a global energy supply shortage. Households are likely to pay around $1.50 more per month.
Hello and welcome to New Day at Arirang. It's Tuesday, June 28th, 8 a.m. here in Seoul, South Korea. I'm Lee-Seung Jae.
And I'm Oh-Young. Thanks very much for tuning in this morning, because over the next hour, we'll be giving you a look at some of the biggest headlines of the day and experts' insights on issues facing Korea and the rest of the world. We begin this Tuesday morning in Madrid, where President Yoon Suk-yeol has just landed for his very first foreign trip as president. For the next 3 days, the new South Korean leader will take part in the NATO summit as a partner nation, carry out more than a dozen bilaterals with leaders of Washington and Tokyo.
That's right. For this, we have our editor-in-chief, Moon Gun-young, joining us all the way from Madrid with this report.
President Yoon Suk-yeol landed in Madrid, the host city of the 2022 NATO summit, late Monday night to participate in the 2-day-long multilateral meeting. Not only is this Yoon's global debut on the multilateral summit scene, but the newly inaugurated president becomes the first South Korean head of state to take part in a NATO summit. South Korea is one of 4 Asia-Pacific partner nations that's been invited to this year's gathering by the 30-member North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Speaking to the traveling press on Air Force One, the less than 2-month-old president seemed confident about his international debut.
NATO 동맹국에다가 이제 뭔가 초청받은 파트너 회담만 한 2시간 반 되고 나머지는 다자회담이 짧게 있어가지고 길게는 못합니다. 39개, 38개 국가 국제기구가 오니까 시간이 많지는 않아요. 얼굴이나 익히고 간단한 현안들이나 좀 서로 확인하고 이제 다음에 다시 또 보자 그런 정도 아니겠나 싶습니다.
Seoul's top office explains that this will serve as an opportunity for South Korea to strengthen solidarity and create a foundation for comprehensive security.
The President will take this opportunity to strengthen solidarity based on values and liberal democracy, establish a base for comprehensive security, and seek effective ways to counter emerging security threats.
At the meeting of the North Atlantic Council with partner nations, Yoon is also expected to unveil his North Korea policy on a global level for the first time, a quote, audacious plan to denuclearize North Korea. But that's not all. The new South Korean president has a queue of enchantés lined up with other heads of state and governments attending the summit. Here, Mr. Yoon will put on his top salesman hat and discuss exports of nuclear power plants, tech cooperation in semiconductors, defense industry, and renewable energy. And there is a brief trilateral between South Korea, U.S., and Japan on the margins of the 2022 NATO, which was only finalized in the 11th hour. This is it, right here in Madrid. From showcasing South Korea as one of the leading nations in global issues and nailing sales diplomacy at the highest level to dealing with Japan ties in the context of Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo, and South Korea-Japan bilateral ties, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol has a lot to prove right here, as this will serve as a litmus test for the next 5 years. Moon Gun-young, Arirang News, Madrid.
NATO has been stepping up engagement with its four Asia-Pacific partners, South Korea, Japan, Australia and New Zealand, this time by inviting them to the 2022 summit in Madrid. Experts say that the move by NATO is an attempt to counter China and its growing threats on the wider global stage. Our Kim Dami with this report.
The 2022 NATO summit may be another sign of Atlantic Pacific nations teaming up against the bellicose challenge of Russia, and particularly the growing global assertiveness of China. By inviting South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand as Asia-Pacific partners, the U.S. is once again making use of NATO to keep Beijing in check.
Countering China at NATO appears to be not enough for the US, since NATO is a European security alliance. So by inviting Indo-Pacific countries, Washington is trying to pinpoint the Chinese threat at NATO.
In fact, NATO's new strategic concept is set to include the very first mention of China and its threats, a clear indication that China issues will no doubt top this year's agenda. Another expert points out that South Korea's debut at the global military alliance also comes in a timely manner.
Economically, the US has brought South Korea into China issues with IPEF, but politically, Seoul cannot join the Quad for now. So the Biden administration has invited South Korea, citing global security reasons.
That also falls in line with the Yoon administration's pursuit of beefing up comprehensive security networks with its partners. Plus, Yoon's presence at NATO will serve as a perfect opportunity for Seoul to drum up international cooperation on North Korea issues, especially the regime's latest nuclear threats. The Biden administration has been upfront that the participation of Indo-Pacific nations at NATO directly targets China. And with Seoul's ambitious goal of strengthening value solidarity based on a liberal democracy, South Korea is expected to play along with Washington's stance. But watchers also caution against the possibility of retaliatory action by Beijing on Seoul, even in a discreet manner, such as during the diesel exhaust fluid shortage in South Korea, which stemmed from China's suspension of urea exports. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
NATO says it will boost its high-readiness forces to more than 300,000 troops from the current 40,000. Speaking to reporters ahead of a summit of NATO leaders, Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg explained Monday that the move is aimed at strengthening its eastern defences. He added that the move makes up partially plans that he called the biggest overhaul of the alliance's collective defence and deterrence since the Cold War.
Now, in the meantime, 2 Russian missiles have slammed into a crowded shopping center in central Ukraine, killing at least 13 people. Amid accusations that Moscow is targeting civilians, the G7 leaders have pledged to provide unwavering support for the war-torn country. Kim Yo-sun has more.
A Russian missile strike has hit a crowded shopping mall in the city of Kremenchuk in central Ukraine. Senior Ukrainian officials say that at least 13 people have been killed while 50 others have been wounded. Footage of the aftermath of the strike circulated by President Volodymyr Zelensky showed dark smoke billowing into the sky from the building. At the time of attack, he explained that more than 1,000 people were in the shopping center. The region's governor called the strike, quote, an act of terrorism against civilians. There was no immediate comment from Moscow, which denies deliberately targeting civilians. Against this backdrop, a UN spokesperson condemned Russia's latest attack.
We don't have any numbers on casualties yet, but it is deplorable, to say the least. Any sort of civilian infrastructure, which includes obviously shopping malls and civilians, should never, ever be targeted.
Western countries from the G7 bloc pledged unwavering support for Ukraine. Meeting in Germany, they said Monday that sanctions on Russia would be kept for as long as necessary. They also vowed $29.5 billion worth of support for the country to ensure Ukraine can deliver basic services to its people. This comes as Zelensky addressed G7 leaders by video, urging them to supply Ukraine with sophisticated missile defense systems and additional aid. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
The leaders of the United States and China could be set for talks in the near future. That's according to U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, speaking at a press briefing on Monday, where he said he expects President Joe Biden and Chinese counterpart Xi Jin-ping to have an opportunity to talk over the next few weeks. He added that the meeting will not immediately follow the G7 summit, which ends Tuesday. Sullivan also spoke of growing convergence among G7 and NATO members over China-related challenges, including issues such as non-market practices, debt, and human rights. President Biden also said earlier this month that he plans to have a conversation with the Chinese president soon.
The United States and Iran will hold indirect talks in Doha from Tuesday to revive the 2015 nuclear deal, also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Representatives from both the European Union will serve as mediators. Iran's foreign ministry told state-run news agency IRNA that the country's negotiating team will go to Qatar to discuss removing anti-Iran sanctions, while an unnamed US State Department official speaking to Reuters also confirmed the meeting. The Qatari government has yet to comment. The talks will follow months of deadlock between the two countries after Tehran insisted that Washington remove its elite military force from the US foreign terrorist organizations list. Seoul's Unification Minister met with the foreign press to clarify where the government stands on inter-Korean issues. Kwon Young-se emphasized that dialogue with the regime is not based on the condition of denuclearization and neither is humanitarian aid. Han Song-woo shared with us his remarks.
South Korea's Unification Minister Kwon Young-se has stressed that the denuclearization of North Korea is a must for inter-Korean relations, but not a prerequisite for engaging in dialogue and offering the regime humanitarian aid. Meeting with foreign media based in Seoul on Monday, Kwon also elaborated on his plans to continue the unification efforts of previous governments that the Yoon administration deems relevant, an approach he refers to as running in a relay race.
Running a relay doesn't mean we'll be copying and pasting the policies from previous administrations, but instead evolving them. We will strongly pursue inter-Korean peace and the improvement of the North's human rights situation without ever giving up on the goal of denuclearizing the regime and ultimately achieving unification.
Regarding the COVID-19 situation there, Minister Kwon confirmed that Pyeongyang is still unresponsive to Seoul's offer of medical assistance. He acknowledged, though, that it does seem China is providing aid behind closed doors, before reiterating Seoul is also willing to provide aid.
There's a need for us to patiently wait. We'll be ready whenever Pyongyang asks for help.
The minister also addressed the elephant in the room, North Korea's reportedly looming 7th nuclear test, saying all that's left for it to happen is likely Kim Jong-un's final call.
To summarize it into one sentence, all preparations are complete, and the only one thing left is a political decision.
Assuming the test will indeed take place, he warned that the Yoon administration won't shy away from carrying out a firm response, more intense than that of previous governments. The minister added that he believes China and Russia do support the denuclearization of the regime, despite the country's recent decision in May to veto a United Nations Security Council's resolution to impose tougher sanctions on Pyeongyang. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
It's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into some of the key issues in the spotlight right now. Now, daily COVID-19 numbers are down, and most importantly, the number of critically ill patients are down as well. But despite the decline, we now have a new concern, which is monkeypox.
That's right, and with South Korea also reporting its very first case of monkeypox just last week. How worried should we be? To find out, we connect with Ben Cowling, Chair Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Hong Kong. Good morning to you, Professor.
Good morning.
So first and foremost, let's kind of start things off with the COVID-19 related issues, as we always do. Again, just like Soo-young mentioned, number of critically ill patients are down significantly compared to the height of the Omicron wave. I mean, are the treatments working better right now, or is Omicron that much less severe compared to some of the other variants?
Well, we know COVID cases go up and down over time. At the moment, they're down. I'm sure they will be up again in the future. Maybe BA5 will find its way into South Korea at some point sooner or later. But now I think it's good that the numbers are low, and it shows the vaccines are working. And also, you mentioned drugs. Antiviral drugs do work very well. They're mostly used to treat more severe cases or to prevent severe disease. So we've got vaccines that work. We've got antivirals that work. I don't think COVID's going to pose as much of a threat in the future, but there may well be rises again in case numbers maybe later this year.
And while there's rising concern, Professor, about waning immunity for those who have been infected by COVID-19 earlier on or were vaccinated more than 6 months ago, and well, what does the data tell us really about how immunity lasts and how long immunity lasts rather, and if you've been infected and if you've been vaccinated?
Yeah, there's two reasons why protection seems to decline over time. One reason is because inside our own bodies, the level of protection that we have got from our vaccinations or infections in the past, that tends to slowly decrease over time for various reasons. The other, though, the main reason why immunity tends to go down is that the virus is changing. And that's the reason why we see reinfections from time to time, including infections in people who got vaccinated some time ago, because the virus has changed to a new strain. And so we don't have so much protection against that new strain anymore. I don't think it's anything very surprising. It happens with other respiratory viruses like flu from time to time. We know that we can get these viruses again and again over the course of our life, but it shouldn't be too frequently. So I don't think there's a major concern about waning per se. We still have the protection against severe disease that we get from our vaccinations and we get from our infections. So what we'll see as a result in the community is just cycles of epidemics and infections in the community, which are mostly mild in the future.
Let's delve into the monkeypox issue right now. At least according to the WHO, it's not a global concern at this moment, but we also here in South Korea report the very first case of the virus. How severe are the symptoms of monkeypox, and also how is this being treated at the same time?
Well, so far outside of Africa, I think there's been more than 1,000, maybe even 2,000 cases reported in all different parts of the world. There haven't been any deaths reported yet outside Africa. We know that it's in general a very mild infection with a rash, maybe some other symptoms of a viral infection like fever and fatigue and so on. It's not going to spread explosively like COVID, but it will spread if it's not stopped. And I think the priority for maybe the CDC in Korea is to find the cases and to isolate them and to trace their contacts and quarantine those and keep an eye on it. It's not going to pose a major public health threat. It spreads slowly, but it will spread if it's not kind of stopped by public health interventions.
And Professor, well, can monkeypox only spread through skin-to-skin contact, or can it be spread through surfaces if an infected person touches a surface of an item or whatever space there is, and a non-infected person goes and touches that as well?
It seems like the main pathway for transmission is prolonged close contact, skin-to-skin contact particularly, with someone who's already got the rash. And that makes them contagious because of the virus in the surface of their skin. But actually, there's still a lot of uncertainties about monkeypox. There have been cases for years in Africa, but it hadn't been studied that carefully in Africa for various reasons, unfortunately. And now that it's in the rest of the world, there's a lot of interest. And I think we're going to see a lot more knowledge becoming available on monkeypox in the coming weeks as there's more and more studies done of cases in different parts of the world. So that's the questions that you asked are still questions that many people around the world are also trying to find out the answers to.
Well, I mean, luckily, you should be sanitizing your hands and washing your hands anyways, as we're still in the COVID-19 pandemic, and where I'm sure a lot of us are still used to that as well. Professor, again, thank you very much for your insights, and we're always looking forward to speaking to you again.
All right, thank you.
And that wraps up the first half of New Day at Arirang.
That's right, but stick around. Coming up next, fuel prices, food prices, consumer prices as a whole is going up. And as they say, the only thing that remains the same is your salary. But will we see a hike in minimum wage next year? We find out during Global Insight, so we'll be back in just a moment.
Share South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduced a Korean New Deal. A Korean survivor of Japan's wartime slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
I feel so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Maybe this is forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Forever.
And welcome back to the second half of New Day at Arirang. Korea Electric Power Corporation announced that electricity prices will be raised by 5 won per kilowatt an hour.
And this comes when many residents are already suffering from inflation. Kim Hyun-sung provides a glimpse of what to expect.
Electricity rates are going to rise by 5 Korean won per kilowatt hour in the third quarter. Korea Electric Power Corporation, or KEPCO, announced the new prices Monday afternoon. For an average household of 4, this will mean their bill goes up by about 1,500 won, or about $1.20. That might not seem like much, but the hottest months of the year are yet to come. And the increase will be felt more because other costs are going up so much with inflation. But the increase is much lower than what KEPCO had suggested. It said it needed a price hike of at least 33 won per kilowatt hour to make up for the money it's been losing because its prices were kept artificially low. With energy prices rising globally, KEPCO in the first quarter posted a loss of more than 7.7 trillion won, or about $6 billion. So the government had to strike a balance as it tries to pull KEPCO out of a deficit and not put too much pressure on consumers. 5 won was where KEPCO and the government struck a deal. The government also made some changes to the energy pricing rules. Until now, electricity rates could go up by no more than 3 won per quarter. Now KEPCO can raise rates by as much as 5 won. Still, with more summer heat on the way, KEPCO is giving bigger discounts to households on low incomes so that they don't have to worry too much about using air conditioning. Up to 3.5 million households could benefit from a discount of almost 10,000 won a month, about $7, which could actually make their bills lower than they were in the second quarter. But gas bills are going to rise next month, too. The monthly gas bill for an average household will go up by around 2,000 won, or more than $1.50. So combined, electricity and gas bills in July will be $3 to $4 higher than they were in June. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
Morgan Stanley forecasts the Bank of Korea will raise interest rates by 25 basis points for each of the 4 remaining meetings this year, resulting in year-end base rate of 2.75%, higher than its estimate from last month of 2.5% with 23 25 basis point rises. It cited the BOK's continuous concerns over inflation and soaring consumer prices as key factors. The central bank is not expected to take a big step, raising 50 basis points at a time, as it has never raised more than 25 until now. Now, 4 South Korean retailers made it to Asia's top 100. The ranking is based on sales. Shinsegae Group grabbed 7th place, Coupang, and 2 others were listed above 20. Shin Se-byuk helps us look beyond the digits.
South Korean retail giant Shinsegae, together with 3 other local firms, have been included in a list of the top 100 retailers in Asia 2022. According to the list released by market researcher Euromonitor last week, Shinsegae Group were 7th, with the highest ranking for a South Korean company. It moved up 2 notches from the previous year and is the only Korean firm in the top 10. Coupang ranked 11th, followed by Lotte at 12th. South Korean internet giant Naver took 15th spot, of 5 places from the year before. An industry expert says that South Korea's competitive edge lies in successfully balancing between online and offline channels.
Big South Korean retailers have so-called multi-retail channels. They realized the importance of managing both online and offline channels quite early and have successfully managed those channels since then. That's what makes those firms stay competitive on the global stage.
The report attributed Shinsegae's strong performance to the group's acquisition of eBay Korea last year, saying the firm successfully built synergy between online and offline sales channels. Overall, Chinese retailers made up the top 3 firms. Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba led the list with sales of almost $479 billion, followed by JD.com and Pinduoduo with their sales of $368 and $112 billion, respectively. The 3 firms together recorded a total of whopping $1 trillion in sales, taking up over 70% of the total sales from the top 10 companies. Meanwhile, calling the Asian retail market a trendsetter, Euromonitor says the Asian market makes up more than 1/3 of the global retail market, with a projected annual growth of 7% until 2026. The market expert also painted a rosy outlook for retail.
Asia is showing a higher economic growth rate than any other region in the world, and this leads people in Asia to spend and consume a lot more. As long as this growth trend continues, the Asian retail market will get bigger.
Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
It's now time for Global Insights, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. A full-fledged tug-of-war has begun over the minimum wage for next year in South Korea. Labour unions are calling for an increase of 18.9% due to the soaring rate of inflation, while the business community argues that the wage floor should be frozen as small shops and firms are simply unable to afford it. The country's minimum wage committee is set to resume discussions on Tuesday, as the deadline to decide the wage floor for next year is drawing closer and closer, with the final rate to be announced by early August. To discuss this highly contentious issue, we're joined by Olga Tek, Director of the Job and Wage Innovation Centre at Korea Labour Institute, and John Byrne, Vice Chair of Research and Senior Research Fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute. Very warm welcome to you both. And well, my first question to you, Dr. Ho, on the situation that's ongoing in our country. South Korea's Federation of Korean Trade Unions and the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, the country's largest two labour unions, they've been calling for a minimum wage of 10,891 per hour. And that is, of course, 18.9% higher than this year's. Do you think this level can actually be met?
I think it's probably not the case. It is the initial offer from the labor side. Usually, the initial offer from the both labor and management side are extreme. As we can see from the previous minimum wage bargaining process, both labor and management side provide the initial offers, and usually there's a big gap between these two offers. Both sides would negotiate the minimum wage level. However, it is really hard to get agreement from this negotiation because both labor and management sides know this kind of process, and they also know that they have to concede somewhat during the negotiation process. They tend to set the initial offer extreme as they concede somewhat from both sides. The gap between their offer would be decreased. If this gap can be managed to set the minimum wage of the next year, then they decide this level as the minimum wage. Otherwise, public members of the minimum wage committee would suggest the promotion session for deliberation of minimum wage. After they try to get agreement within this range, it would be decided by agreement or voting of committee members. Therefore, I think the initial offer from Korean trade unions is less likely to be both their final offer and final decision.
Well, until that final decision is made, I suppose we can expect a lot of shouting matches, a lot of heated debates until they work out some concessions on both sides. And well, Dr. Byrne, workers tend to think that the higher the minimum wage, the better, while the employers tend to think the opposite. They prefer a lower wage floor. But what is the right level? I mean, what factors should be considered?
Well, that's a very good question. I think on the workers' side, of course, it's important to take into account what the real level of wage rise will be, not just the nominal. So that's why inflation is a very important concern in the current environment, and it's making negotiations very difficult. So at the end of the day, let's remember what the purpose of the minimum wage is. It's to increase the standard of living, and this is only done when the wage rise is in real terms. So also taking into account the general price level rises in the economy, and this outlook, of course, is very uncertain. On the employer side, of course, there's a preference to have a floor and a mitigated impact on their overall labor costs coming from minimum wage rises. So that's something that employers need to take into account in their negotiations. But on the other hand, there are also other factors to consider, such as the rises in morale, increased retention costs, and overall increase in productivity that could be yielded from increased minimum wages. But of course, it's important to reach the right level, and this is a very challenging environment to set that level given uncertainty with inflation. And it's even more important in the current environment, I would say, because developments in the labour market will actually determine whether inflation stays high at this level. And this is something that policymakers are paying close attention to at the moment.
And Dr. Oh, have higher minimum wages in South Korea, which soared over 40% during the past 5 years, generally led to more benefits or drawbacks?
I think there would be both benefit and drawbacks from the minimum wage policy. The most important benefit is to contribute to decrease the social inequality. Korea is one of the society in which there is a big gap between dual labor market, and then this kind of a labor market gap would lead to income inequality. Korea's income equality would be generated from many factors, including firm size, employment type, and then the industry classification, and so on. One of the powerful ways to decrease income inequality is to increase a minimum wage level. There is some empirical finding that a relatively high level of the minimum wage increase of Korea nowadays decrease degree of income inequality in Korea. On the other hand, there is a drawback too. The most big drawback would be the negative impact on small and medium-sized companies and small business owners. Usually, small and medium-sized company and small business owners would have relatively low level of ability to pay. Therefore, if the minimum wage level is increased too much, then they would decide to decrease the employment or give up the business. This kind of phenomena would have a negative impact on employment of a Korean labor market as a whole.
But Dr. Ban, we're hearing about the cost of living continuing to rise at just crazy levels all around the world. And is raising the minimum wage the best way to address the cost of living crisis?
It's a very good question. I think that raising the minimum wage is one of the ways, but if we think about the purpose of the measure itself, it's to essentially increase the standard of living for low-paid workers. And there are other measures which may be also important to take into account in this respect, such as, for example, tax credits on income, subsidies, transfer payments, and these types of measures arguably can be more important in an environment of uncertainty as regards the persistence of high inflation, which makes setting the minimum wage rise very difficult to ascertain. So I think that perhaps a combination of different factors should be taken into account in a period of uncertainty, certainly over the next year, and certainly actually till the end of this year and the start of 2023.
Well, Dr. Oh, Korean businesses, they tend to argue that the current minimum wage is 62% of the current median wage, making that figure one of the highest in the world. But does that make it sufficient, though, for the average Korean worker? I mean, how does South Korea's minimum wage compare to countries with similar socio-economic conditions?
I think the minimum wage level is relatively high compared to the other advanced countries. In terms of the minimum wage level, compared to the median wage, Korea ranks 8th among 30 OECD countries and the highest among G7 countries. The minimum wage level compared to the median wage level is used as a comparison of a minimum wage across countries because the absolute minimum wage level is hard to be compared across countries since each country has a different GDP and price level. Other countries like France is 60.9%, UK is 58.2%, Germany is 53.8%, Canada 48.3%, Japan 45.5%, and then USA is 28.3%. This is because of the relatively high level of minimum wage increase nowadays in Korea, which is 44.6% from 2016 to 2021. During the same period, the minimum wage level increase was 26.5% in Canada, 23.1% in UK, 13% in Japan, and 12 to 4% in Germany, and 6% in France. The market wage compared to the minimum wage is relatively high in other countries like Japan and USA. The minimum wage of Japan is about 9,030 yen. However, it is hard to employ workers less than 1,200 yen in Japan. Similarly, as long as my knowledge is concerned, the minimum wage of California of US is $14, but most of fast food restaurants suggest at least $17.
And Dr. Ban, well, with energy and food costs on the rise, the lowest paid workers are under particular pressure. And how disproportionate is the impact of inflation on the lower paid households?
Yes, well, I think there are clear cross-country differences in the level of exposure of vulnerable groups to external price pressures. And this, of course, is the purpose for having measures in place to increase the standard of living of these types of low-paid workers. I think that in the near term, it will be a challenge to really impact upon the standard of living of these low income groups, because, as stated earlier, inflation is a key concern. So even though nominal wage rises may be agreed, in real terms, the impact may be disproportionately lower. And this points towards additional measures which may help in the short term, such as, which I have reflected already, subsidies, transfer payments, and other types of tax credits which may be beneficial. That said, there are clear fiscal constraints at the moment coming out of the pandemic. So I think that there remains some challenges ahead for policymakers and all parties involved in these important discussions.
And well, this question goes to both of you, but let's begin with you first, Dr. Oh. In an age of income polarization, with IT moguls and big businesses really accumulating wealth, while the 99% really struggle to secure both current and future prospects, what should be the approach to setting the minimum wage?
I think it's quite a tricky question. One of the positive effects of minimum wage is to diminish the wage polarization. Therefore, we need to consider many things in deciding minimum wage. We need to think about the price level of the national economy, the living standard of the workers, and then competitiveness of the company. This would be the tricky part of the minimum wage discussion, negotiation, and then decision. I think there is no better way than focusing on fundamental factors. We need to consider what would be the effect of a minimum wage on both workers and companies, and try to find the best or the second to the best way to reconcile these two factors. Another policy to consider is how to improve the competitiveness of the company. To improve competitiveness of the company, we can think about workplace innovation, in which the working method is changed, and then the way of management of working is also changed. By changing both the working method and then the way of management, company would find other ways of business and then some better strategies. During this kind of innovation process, I hope firms might find a way to meet the minimum wage.
Well, Dr. Byrne, on one end, we're seeing highly paid workers at IT firms and corporate giants just making ridiculous, just astronomical sums of money, while on the other end of the spectrum, people can barely afford their next meal. How should the discussion on minimum wage change?
Well, I think that inflation and inflation uncertainty is going to play a key factor in the current discussions. To take the discussion a little bit deeper, it would be important to look at whether the target low-paid workers are really benefiting from this. Basically, it can be the case that those on minimum wages are not from low-income households. So a better targeting in the discussion may be helpful in the calibration. As well as that, on the employer side, I think that there are clear pressures on firm profitability and tight margins in particular sectors, which are even more apparent as we emerge from the pandemic. So this also needs to be taken into account when setting the appropriate rate, which would bring both parties together, whereby real wage rises would allow for additional disposable income, which can boost consumption and boost the economic outlook. But at the same time, it's important not to have this type of wage price spiral effect, whereby firms would actually be forced to increase their prices because the minimum wage rate rise may be set at too high a level. And this, of course, would create clear problems for policymakers in the longer term and actually worsen the economic outlook.
Well, hopefully discussions on wage levels all over the world will lead to the gap really being narrowed between two very polarised ends of the spectrum. But this is where we must wrap up the interview today. That was Olga Tek, Director of Job and Wage Innovation Centre at Korea Labour Institute, and John Byrne, Vice Chair of Research and Senior Research Fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute. Thank you both so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. At least 10 people have been killed and 251 injured following a chlorine gas leak in Jordan's southern port city of Aqaba. The leak on Monday came from a tank carrying 25 metric tons of the chlorine gas, which was being exported to Djibouti. Footage shows the tank falling from a winch onto a ship's deck, followed by a yellow-colored gas escaping into the air. According to officials, the area has been sealed off after evacuating the injured to hospitals for treatment. Specialists have been dispatched to handle the leak. Nearby residents have been urged to stay indoors and keep windows and doors shut. Appealing to governments around the world at the United Nations Ocean Conference, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres asked for more efforts to save the world's dying oceans. Speaking at the start of the 5-day event on Monday in the Portuguese capital, Lisbon, Guterres requested a larger commitment of funds to create a sustainable economic model for managing the world's oceans. Roughly 7,000 people are expected to attend the conference, including heads of state, scientists, and NGOs. Guterres told them that the ocean is facing a crisis.
Sadly, we have taken the ocean for granted. And today we face what I would call an ocean emergency. We must turn the tide.
The ocean plays a vital role in the planet's ecosystem, generating half of the world's oxygen and absorbing a quarter of all CO2 emissions. But temperature increases have made ocean waters more acidic. In the U.S. state of Missouri, an Amtrak train carrying 243 passengers and 12 crew has derailed. The train was traveling from Los Angeles to Chicago on Monday when it hit a dump truck at a rail crossing. Multiple deaths have been reported, while 3 passengers have been taken to a nearby hospital, and emergency services are working to free those trapped inside the carriages. Photos posted to Twitter show what appear to be the remains of a truck in the wreckage and people clambering out of the 8 derailed train carriages. This is the second train collision in 2 days. On Sunday, an Amtrak train hit a passenger vehicle, leading to 3 deaths and 2 major injuries. Brazil might be known for Rio de Janeiro's famous carnival, but another major festival happened this week in the Amazon rainforest. The Boi Bumba Festival celebrates the color, music, and traditions of the Amazonian folklore. It returned to the city of Parintins on Saturday, following a 2-year pause due to the pandemic. The event is marked by a contest between red and blue teams, Garantido and Caprichoso, as they portray a legend about a resurrected ox. For 3 days, each team works to outperform the other with their diverse portrayals using color, rhythmic performances, and floats. On Monday, Caprichoso team were named this year's winner. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good morning. Well, it has been a very rough end of June weather this year with heavy monsoon rain and tropical nights. More rain clouds are forming in the country's north. We'll be dropping rain on northern parts of Gyeonggi-do and Gangwon-do provinces during the first half of the day. In central regions, we'll be seeing heavier rain again, and the capital could receive up to 200 millimeters into tomorrow. Remaining central regions could see up to 120 millimeters. What's more, a strong wind advisory has been issued along coastal regions and in the capital. So we'll need some good strong umbrellas today. Meanwhile, another tropical night in Seoul. In fact, today's highs will be actually lower than morning temperatures, but heat continues in certain parts of the country. It's a very warm and humid start to the day. Highs in Jeju are already close to 30 degrees Celsius this morning. And by the afternoon, Seoul will be topping out at 25 degrees, Daegu at 31. Please brace for stormy weather today. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that wraps up our newscast for this hour, but we'll be back tomorrow for our Wednesday's edition of New Day at Arirang.
Thanks ever so much for joining us this morning, and do stick around for more updates throughout the day. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are. Goodbye.